Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal with Joe Sternberg and Bill McGurn. Let's talk about the G-7, which is meeting this week. These are the leaders of the main industrialized developed democracies: Japan, Germany, Britain, the U.S., Canada, France, and Italy. And it's notable this year, not for their strength, but for their weakness. I mean, when you think about it, it's an incredible lineup of people who may all be out of office by the next meeting, if not sooner. I mean, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Britain, he's going to suffer a crushing defeat here on July 4th in parliamentary elections. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, his party took a drubbing. His coalition may not survive the next election. Justin Trudeau is the very definition of weakness, with a weak economy, unpopular at home, and can't spend enough to satisfy his defense commitments. Macron faces a big test in the Assembly, and Fumio Kishida, the Japanese prime minister, his approval rating of his cabinet is down to 16.4%, believe it or not, which is down there with friends and family amid a campaign financing scandal. Kishida, I think, wants to do some good things. He's been particularly good on defense, but his party's not popular. So then you've got President Biden. Obviously, he could lose re-election. So the giant in Europe right now, Joe, is Giorgia Meloni, who much maligned as a right-wing lunatic when she took office in 2022, but is the only one here who's governing with some success and popularity.
Exactly. Who would have thought? Because, I mean, it used to be for years and years that every time one of these meetings rolled around every 6 months or a year, there would be a different Italian prime minister. And now she seems to be the most durable leader in Western Europe, certainly seems to be leading one of the most stable coalition governments. I think there are probably a couple elements to that. One of those is that she seems to have figured out somehow the right mix of how, as a politician, she can mold herself and her party to build the biggest possible electoral coalition to actually win, and then how you can govern in a way that will keep more of those people on team with you. So, I mean, part of her story is this phenomenon that we've commented on in other places of moving the party a bit to the center in order to turn it into a viable governing party. They no longer oppose Euro membership, very pro-Ukraine, and on down the line. And I think you couple that with the fact that the Italian economy right now doesn't seem to be quite as dysfunctional as it has been at various times over the past decade. And, that's putting her in a pretty good position. And again, I think part of it is some good fortune on the economy, but part of it also is political skill. And it points out that a big part of the challenge here is not just to blame voters if you get an election outcome that you don't like, but to understand how to communicate with voters so that you can kind of get what they want you to do as a political leader, but then you can also persuade them effectively when you need to do that.
The G7 was created during the Cold War to send a message of Western unity and strength against the Soviet Union. The great irony is it's now sending a message of democratic weakness. And that's dangerous given the fact that Russia, China, Tehran, and others are pushing to take advantage of that weakness and working together increasingly to do so. So that's a real problem. And I think the other thing is they can't agree on a heck of a lot. I mean, a good example this week seems to be the Europeans and the United States can't even agree on how to handle Russia's sovereign assets to help Ukraine. There's more than $300 billion that is held overseas. It's been frozen in Western financial accounts. The U.S. would like to confiscate that and use it for Ukraine, but Europe doesn't. So we have, as a compromise, what looks like a convoluted plan to use some of the interest on the assets to help Ukrainians with a scheme to pay it back somehow, sometime. I think, Joe, in my view, the U.S. view would have prevailed in previous years but not this time.
I think this is just a study in the importance of real political leadership and why the world needs it and the dangers that you face when you don't have it. Because I think that you're absolutely right, Paul, that you end up with a major and rather complicated question of what to do with these Russian assets. And yet there doesn't seem to be anyone with the stature or the capacity to actually bring their peers within the G7 along behind a particular position. And I think that that's because the U.S. traditionally would have served that role, and yet the current administration often seems so confused and internally divided about what it wants to ask other people to do that by the time it's doing the asking, it can't do it effectively.
Bill, when you were a speechwriter for George W. Bush,
Right.
I think you had to prepare remarks for the G7. You might have even attended one or two of those meetings, although you're not in the room.
Right.
Only the principals are in the room at certain discussions. But are you struck by the kind of waning power influence of these leadership?
Yeah, especially the G7, because it represents basically America, Western Europe, and Japan, which were at the time the most dynamic and advanced economies in the world. And if you step back, what we were talking about before the European Parliament, these groups really served a purpose. I know it's not popular to say this, but the two principles animating U.S. foreign policy were increasing trade with the world and linking them by trade, and also mutual defense like NATO and stuff. And they've both been attenuated. And those are goals that are best served in a multilateral way. And that's what these alliances are. And Donald Trump has been very hostile to some of them. Biden's been weak. And I think it's a question, he's weak about them. But Donald Trump doesn't like multilateral institutions, but they actually create more partners for the U.S. and more opportunities. And I think Joe alluded to this. When the U.S. is weak, most of these international associations are weak too. It requires the U.S. to play a leadership role. And you can't have a U.S. weak at home, struggling with the economy, and really providing forceful leadership for other countries.
Well said, Bill. And that is going to be the last word today. We will see what the G7 brings. Probably not all that much, but we'll be here every day on Potomac Watch to chronicle it. And particularly this week, we're watching the U.S. Supreme Court, which is coming into its final home stretch here on big cases. So we'll be talking about those in the days ahead. Thanks for listening.